Hemagglutinin encephalomyelitis virus, Hemagglutinin encephalomyelitis virus, Hemagglutinin encephalomyelitis virus, Hemagglutinating virus, Hemagglutinating virus, Hemagglutinating virus, Hemagglutinin, 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 Hemalnode, 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 Hemangioendothelioma, 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 Hemangioma, 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 Hemangioperocytoma, 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 Hemangiosarcoma, 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 Hematin pigment, Hematin pigment, Hematin pigment, Hematochezia, 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 Hematoma, 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 Hematopoiesis, 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 Hemivertebra, 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 Hemobertonellosis, 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 Hemochromatosis, 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 Hemoglobin, 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 Hemoglobinuric nephrosis, Hemoglobinuric nephrosis, Hemoglobinuric nephrosis, Hemolytic uremic syndrome, Hemolytic uremic syndrome, Hemolytic uremic syndrome, Hemopericardium, 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 Hemoperitonum, 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 Hemophilia, 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 Hemorrhage, 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 Hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, Hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, Hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, Hemorrhagic canine gastroenteritis, Hemorrhagic canine gastroenteritis, Hemorrhagic canine gastroenteritis, Hemorrhagic diathesis, Hemorrhagic diathesis, Hemorrhagic diathesis, Hemorrhagic disease, Hemorrhagic disease, Hemorrhagic disease, Hemorrhagic enteritis, Hemorrhagic enteritis, Hemorrhagic enteritis, Hemorrhagic septicemia, Hemorrhagic septicemia, Hemorrhagic septicemia, Hemorrhagic shock, Hemorrhagic shock, Hemorrhagic shock, Hemosiderin, 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 Hemosiderosis, 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 Hemostasis, 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 Hemathorax, 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 Heparin, 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 Hepatic, 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 Hepatic abiotrophy, Hepatic abiotrophy, Hepatic abiotrophy, Hepatic abscess, Hepatic abscess, Hepatic abscess, Hepatic arterioportal fistulae, Hepatic arterioportal fistulae, Hepatic arterioportal fistulae, Hepatic arteriovenous fistula, Hepatic arteriovenous fistula, Hepatic arteriovenous fistula, Hepatic artery, Hepatic artery, Hepatic artery, Hepatic coccidiosis, Hepatic coccidiosis, Hepatic coccidiosis, Hepatic congestion, Hepatic congestion, Hepatic congestion, Hepatic dystemiosis, Hepatic dystemiosis, Hepatic dystemiosis, Hepatic ectopia, Hepatic ectopia, Hepatic ectopia, Hepatic encephalopathy, Hepatic encephalopathy, Hepatic encephalopathy, Hepatic failure, Hepatic failure, Hepatic failure, Hepatic fibrosis, Hepatic fibrosis, Hepatic fibrosis, Hepatic granuloma, Hepatic granuloma, Hepatic granuloma, Hepatic leukocytosis, Hepatic leukocytosis, Hepatic leukocytosis, Hepatic lymph, Hepatic lymph, Hepatic lymph, Hepatic mass, Hepatic mass, Hepatic mass, Hepatic necropsylosis, Hepatic necropsylosis, Hepatic necropsylosis, Hepatic necrosis, Hepatic necrosis, Hepatic necrosis, Hepatic tuberculosis, Hepatic tuberculosis, Hepatic tuberculosis, Hepatic veins, Hepatic veins, Hepatic veins, hepatization, 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 hepatocellular adenoma, hepatocellular adenoma, hepatocellular adenoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, hepatocellular degenerations, hepatocellular degenerations, hepatocellular degenerations, hepatocellular fusion, hepatocellular fusion, hepatocellular fusion, hepatocyte, 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 hepatomegaly, 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 hepatopathy, 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 hepatoportal fibrosis, hepatoportal fibrosis, hepatoportal fibrosis, Hepatornal syndromes, hepatornal syndromes, hepatornal syndromes, hepatocystetica, 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 hepatotoxicity, 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 hepatotoxins, 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 herbicide application, herbicide application, herbicide application, hereditary cochleoacular degeneration, hereditary cochleoacular degeneration, hereditary cochleoacular degeneration, hereditary collagen dysplasia, hereditary collagen dysplasia, hereditary collagen dysplasia, hereditary deforming chondrodysplasia, hereditary deforming chondrodysplasia, hereditary deforming chondrodysplasia, hereditary hypocomplementemia, hereditary hypocomplementemia, hereditary hypocomplementemia, hereditary muscular dystrophy, hereditary muscular dystrophy, hereditary muscular dystrophy, hereditary myelopathy, hereditary myelopathy, hereditary myelopathy, hereditary myoclonus, hereditary myoclonus, hereditary myoclonus, hereditary neuronal hereditary neuronal hereditary neuronal hereditary perikeratosis, hereditary perikeratosis, hereditary perikeratosis, hereditary spinal muscular atrophy, hereditary spinal muscular atrophy, hereditary spinal muscular atrophy, hereditary stomatocytosis, hereditary stomatocytosis, hereditary stomatocytosis, hereditary striatonigral degeneration, hereditary striatonigral degeneration, hereditary striatonigral degeneration, hereditary thymic hypoplasia, hereditary thymic hypoplasia, hereditary thymic hypoplasia, heritable myotonia, heritable myotonia, heritable myotonia, hermaphrodite, 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 hernia, 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 herpes virus infection, herpes virus infection, herpes virus infection, heterochromia iridis, heterochromia iridis, heterochromia iridis, heterotopic mineralization, heterotopic mineralization, heterotopic mineralization, heterotopic polyiodonta, heterotopic polyiodonta, heterotopic polyiodonta, hiatus hernia, hiatus hernia, hiatus hernia, high altitude disease, high altitude disease, high altitude disease, high endothelial venule, high endothelial venule, high endothelial venule, high phosphate diet, high phosphate diet, high phosphate diet, hip dysplasia, hip dysplasia, hip dysplasia, histamine, 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 ischiocytic gastritis, ischiocytic gastritis, ischiocytic gastritis, ischiocytic ulcerative colitis, ischiocytic ulcerative colitis, ischiocytic ulcerative colitis, ischiocytoma, 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 ischiocytosis, 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 histoplasmosis, 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 hives, 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 hog cholera, hog cholera, hog cholera, holoprosencephaly, 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 homing receptors, homing receptors, homing receptors, homing tendency, homing tendency, homing tendency, hookworm infection, hookworm infection, hookworm infection, hormonal hypersensitivity, hormonal hypersensitivity, hormonal hypersensitivity, hormone, 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 horn cyst, horn cyst, horn cyst, horseshoe kidney, horseshoe kidney, horseshoe kidney, humoral condyle, humoral condyle, humoral condyle, humoral hypercalcemia, humoral hypercalcemia, humoral hypercalcemia, hyaline body, hyaline body, hyaline body, hyaline degeneration, hyaline degeneration, hyaline degeneration, hyaline globules, hyaline globules, hyaline globules, hyaline membrane formation, hyaline membrane formation, hyaline membrane formation, hyaline thrombi, hyaline thrombi, hyaline thrombi, hyaloid artery, hyaloid artery, hyaloid artery, hydatid cyst, hydatid cyst, hydatid cyst, hydatid disease, hydatid disease, hydatid disease, hydatid, 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 hydrolazine, 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 hydramnios, 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 hydranencephaly, 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 hydrocele, 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 hydrocephalus, 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 hydrometra, 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 hydromyelia, 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 hydronephrosis, 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 hydroprecardium, 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 hydroperidonum, 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 hydropic degeneration, hydropic degeneration, hydropic degeneration, hydrosalpinx, 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 hydrothorax, 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 hydroureter, 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 hyena disease, hyena disease, hyena disease, hygroma, 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 hyperadrenecorticism, 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 hypercalcemia, 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 hypercalcemic nephropathy, hypercalcemic nephropathy, hypercalcemic nephropathy, hypercholesterolemia, 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 hypercoagulable state, hypercoagulable state, hypercoagulable state, hypercortisolism, 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 hyperemia, 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 hyperglycemia, 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 hyperkalemia, 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 hyperkeratosis, 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 hyperlipemia, 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 hyperlipoproteinemia, 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 hyperosmolality, 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 hyperparathyroidism, 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 hyperphosphatemia, 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 hyperpigmentation, 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 hyperplasia, 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 hyperplastic and neoplastic disease, hyperplastic and neoplastic disease, hyperplastic and neoplastic disease, hyperplastic gingivitis, hyperplastic gingivitis, hyperplastic gingivitis, hypersecretion, 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 hypersensitivity, 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 hypersensitivity angiitis, hypersensitivity angiitis, hypersensitivity angiitis, hypersensitivity dermatoses, hypersensitivity dermatoses, hypersensitivity dermatoses, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, hypersplenism, 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 hypertension, 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 hypertensive retinopathy, hypertensive retinopathy, hypertensive retinopathy, hyperthermia, 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 hyperthyroidism, 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 hypertrichosis, 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 hypertrophic liver cirrhosis, hypertrophic liver cirrhosis, hypertrophic liver cirrhosis, hypertrophic neuropathy, hypertrophic neuropathy, hypertrophic neuropathy, hypertrophic osteopathy, hypertrophic osteopathy, hypertrophic osteopathy, hypertrophic scar, hypertrophic scar, hypertrophic scar, hypertrophy, 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 hypoadrenocorticism, 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 hypocalcemia, 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 hypocomplemenemia, 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 hypoglycemia, 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 hypokalemia, 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 hypokalemic nephropathy, hypokalemic nephropathy, hypokalemic nephropathy, hypomagnesemia, 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 hypoparathyroidism, 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 hypophyseal change, hypophyseal change, hypophyseal change, hyperpigmentation, 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 hypopituitarism, 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 hypoplasia, 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 hypoplastic kidney, hypoplastic kidney, hypoplastic kidney, hypoproteinemia, 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 hypopion, 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 hypospadias, 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 hypotensive shock, hypotensive shock, hypotensive shock, hypothalamus, 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 hypothyroidism, 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 hypotrichosis, 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 hypovolemia, 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 hypoxia, 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 Ibaraki disease, Ibaraki disease, Ibaraki disease, ichthyosis, 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 icterus, 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 idiopathic adrenocortical atrophy, idiopathic adrenocortical atrophy, idiopathic adrenocortical atrophy, idiopathic chronic liver disease, idiopathic chronic liver disease, idiopathic chronic liver disease, idiopathic colitis, idiopathic colitis, idiopathic colitis, idiopathic granulomatous enteritis, idiopathic granulomatous enteritis, idiopathic granulomatous enteritis, idiopathic lymphocytic uveitis, idiopathic lymphocytic uveitis, idiopathic lymphocytic uveitis, idiopathic mucosal colitis, idiopathic mucosal colitis, idiopathic mucosal colitis, idiopathic pericardial hemorrhage, idiopathic pericardial hemorrhage, idiopathic pericardial hemorrhage, alliomuscular hypertrophy, alliomuscular hypertrophy, alliomuscular hypertrophy, ileus, 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 iliac thromboembolism, iliac thromboembolism, iliac thromboembolism, immune complex, immune complex, immune complex, immune-mediated dermatosis, immune-mediated dermatosis, immune-mediated dermatosis, immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, immune-mediated hepatocyte necrosis, immune-mediated hepatocyte necrosis, immune-mediated hepatocyte necrosis, immunity, 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 immunodeficiency, 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 immunoglobulin, 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 immunology, 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 immunotolerance, 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 impaction, 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 imperforate, buccopharyngeal membrane, imperforate buccopharyngeal membrane, imperforate buccopharyngeal membrane, imperforate hymen, imperforate hymen, imperforate hymen, imperforate pectinate ligament, imperforate pectinate ligament, imperforate pectinate ligament, imperforate urethra, imperforate urethra, imperforate urethra, impetigo, 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 impetigo contagiosa, impetigo contagiosa, impetigo contagiosa, inactive osteoblast, inactive osteoblast, inactive osteoblast, incarceration, 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 inclusion body, inclusion body, inclusion body, inclusion body renitis, inclusion body renitis, inclusion body renitis, incomplete atrophy, incomplete atrophy, incomplete atrophy, increased intracranial pressure, increased intracranial pressure, increased intracranial pressure, indolent ulcer, indolent ulcer, indolent ulcer, infarct, 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 infectious balanoposthitis, infectious balanoposthitis, infectious balanoposthitis, infectious bovine cervicovaginitis and epididymitis, infectious bovine cervicovaginitis and epididymitis, infectious bovine cervicovaginitis and epididymitis, infectious bovine keratoconjunctivitis, infectious bovine keratoconjunctivitis, infectious bovine keratoconjunctivitis, infectious bovine rhinotracheatis, infectious bovine rhinotracheatis, infectious bovine rhinotracheatis, infectious bovine rhinotracheatus virus, infectious bovine rhinotracheatus virus, infectious bovine rhinotracheatus virus, infectious bulbar paralysis, infectious bulbar paralysis, infectious bulbar paralysis, infectious canine hepatitis, infectious canine hepatitis, infectious canine hepatitis, infectious equine encephalomyelitis, infectious equine encephalomyelitis, infectious equine encephalomyelitis, infectious feline enteritis, infectious feline enteritis, infectious feline enteritis, infectious keratoconjunctivitis, infectious keratoconjunctivitis, infectious keratoconjunctivitis, infectious labial dermatitis, infectious labial dermatitis, infectious labial dermatitis, infectious necrotic hepatitis, infectious necrotic hepatitis, infectious necrotic hepatitis, infectious pustular vulvovaginitis, infectious pustular vulvovaginitis, infectious pustular vulvovaginitis, infectious tracheobronchitis, infectious tracheobronchitis, infectious tracheobronchitis, infective bulbar necrosis, infective bulbar necrosis, infective bulbar necrosis, infertility, 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 infiltrative lipoma, infiltrative lipoma, infiltrative lipoma, inflammation, 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 infraction, 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 infundibular necrosis, infundibular necrosis, infundibular necrosis, infundibular stenosis, infundibular stenosis, infundibular stenosis, infundibioma, 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 inguinal hernia, inguinal hernia, inguinal hernia, inherited congenital myoclonus, inherited congenital myoclonus, inherited congenital myoclonus, inherited epidermal dysplasia, inherited epidermal dysplasia, inherited epidermal dysplasia, inherited retinal atrophy, inherited retinal atrophy, inherited retinal atrophy, inhibin, 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 inner ear, inner ear, inner ear, insecticides, 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 insulin, 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 insulinoma, 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 insulin resistance, insulin resistance, insulin resistance, intact nephron hypothesis, intact nephron hypothesis, intact nephron hypothesis, intercellular edema, intercellular edema, intercellular edema, interdigital dermatitis, interdigital dermatitis, interdigital dermatitis, interface dermatitis, interface dermatitis, interface dermatitis, interferon, 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 interleukins, 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 internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery, internal hernia, internal hernia, internal hernia, internal hordeolum, internal hordeolum, internal hordeolum, intersex, 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 interstitial cell adenoma, interstitial cell adenoma, interstitial cell adenoma, interstitial cell tumor, interstitial cell tumor, interstitial cell tumor, interstitial nephritis, interstitial nephritis, interstitial nephritis, interstitial pancreatitis, interstitial pancreatitis, interstitial pancreatitis, interstitial pneumonia, interstitial pneumonia, interstitial pneumonia, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, intestinal adenocarcinoma, intestinal adenocarcinoma, intestinal adenocarcinoma, intestinal adenoma, intestinal adenoma, intestinal adenoma, intestinal adenomatosis, intestinal adenomatosis, intestinal adenomatosis, intestinal aspergillosis, intestinal aspergillosis, intestinal aspergillosis, intestinal atresia, intestinal atresia, intestinal atresia, intestinal diverticulum, intestinal diverticulum, intestinal diverticulum, intestinal emphysema, intestinal emphysema, intestinal emphysema, intestinal fluke infection, intestinal fluke infection, intestinal fluke infection, intestinal helminth infection, intestinal helminth infection, intestinal helminth infection, intestinal hemorrhage syndrome, intestinal hemorrhage syndrome, intestinal hemorrhage syndrome, intestinal impaction, intestinal impaction, intestinal impaction, intestinal lipofuscinosis, intestinal lipofuscinosis, intestinal lipofuscinosis, intestinal mast cell tumor, intestinal mast cell tumor, intestinal mast cell tumor, intestinal obstruction, intestinal obstruction, intestinal obstruction, intestinal phycomycosis, intestinal phycomycosis, intestinal phycomycosis, intestinal polyp, intestinal polyp, intestinal polyp, intestinal sclerosis, intestinal sclerosis, intestinal sclerosis, intestinal smooth muscle, intestinal smooth muscle, intestinal smooth muscle, intestinal stenosis, intestinal stenosis, intestinal stenosis, intestinal ulcer, intestinal ulcer, intestinal ulcer, intestine, 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 animal bodies, animal bodies, animal bodies, intracellular edema, intracellular edema, intracellular edema, intracutaneous corneal epithelioma, intracutaneous corneal epithelioma, intracutaneous corneal epithelioma, intraepidermal pustular dermatitis, intraepidermal pustular dermatitis, intraepidermal pustular dermatitis, intrafusal fibers, intrafusal fibers, intrafusal fibers, intramembranous osteogenesis, intramembranous osteogenesis, intramembranous osteogenesis, intranasal neuroblastoma, intranasal neuroblastoma, intranasal neuroblastoma, intrarenal reflux, intrarenal reflux, intrarenal reflux, intravascular hemolysis, intravascular hemolysis, intravascular hemolysis, intussusception, 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 involucrum, 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 iodine, 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 iridocyclitis, 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 iris, 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 iris bomb, iris bomb, iris bomb, iris hypoplasia, iris hypoplasia, iris hypoplasia, iris prolapse, iris prolapse, iris prolapse, iridis, 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 irradiation, 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 ischemia, 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 ischemic necrosis, ischemic necrosis, ischemic necrosis, islet cell tumor, islet cell tumor, islet cell tumor, B. Japanese B. encephalitis, B. Japanese B. encephalitis, B. Japanese B. encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis, jaundice, 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 Gembrinid disease, Gembrinid disease, Gembrinid disease, Johnny's disease, Johnny's disease, Johnny's disease, joint, 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 juvenile nephropathy, juvenile nephropathy, juvenile nephropathy, juvenile osteomyelitis, juvenile osteomyelitis, juvenile osteomyelitis, juxtaglomerular apparatus, juxtaglomerular apparatus, juxtaglomerular apparatus, calicrane, 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 kanamycin, 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 kangaroo, 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 kangaroo gait, kangaroo gait, kangaroo gait, ceratic precipitates, ceratic precipitates, ceratic precipitates, Currane cyst, Currane cyst, Currane cyst, Keratinocyte, 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 keratitis, 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 keratoconthoma, 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 keratoconjunctivitis, 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 keratoconjunctivitis sicca, keratoconjunctivitis sicca, keratoconjunctivitis sicca, keratomalacia, 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 keratoses, 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 ketosis, 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 kidney, kidney, kidney,